I'm not a politician, have no desire to be a politician. You don't have to be a politician to know how to do what's right. You need to be a politician to do what's politically expedient. And we've had that for far too long. And it's time for us to return to the values and principles that made this into a great nation.
Dr. Ben Carson may lack political experience, but the GOP presidential hopeful is beating the odds. According to a recent Quinnipiac poll, Dr. Carson is among the top 5 Republican candidates, joined in that group by Jeb Bush, Mike Huckabee, Scott Walker, and Marco Rubio, all experienced politicians. So how did this relative newcomer to political life achieve such initial success? We're joined now via Skype from Washington, D.C. by Armstrong Williams. He is the host of the Armstrong Williams Show, and though he has no official role in the Ben Carson for President campaign, he has been a longtime personal and business advisor to Dr. Ben Carson. I believe, what, Armstrong, spanning some 2 decades?
It's been a long time, Congressman. How are you? And thank you for having me on today.
Doing very well, and we should point out for the record, this is the most exclusive of exclusive interviews. You haven't done an interview like this about Dr. Ben Carson and his political campaign, and you tell me it's the only one you're going to do, so we want to thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Armstrong, what do you think has led to this initial success for Dr. Carson? Is he the ultimate anti-politician?
Well, you know, Dr. Carson and his legendary career as a pediatric neurosurgeon has operated, counseled medically heads of states, monarchies, leaders, common people, everyday people in the inner city. And through that 30-plus year as a leading world-renowned pediatric neurosurgeon, he's had a chance to talk about a lot of things with a lot of families as they prep for the operation and after the operation. There are a lot of things that they talked about. It gave him such a vast education of the world and where people are. And being the person that he was and continued to be in the business of health and medicine, he at one point was on the President Obama's commission that, well, President Obama inherited him as a carryover from President Bush, where he studied issues like bioethics and issues like healthcare. And very briefly, he was advising the White House about healthcare and the things that the administration were thinking about doing. But then Dr. Carson realized early on in a conversation with a very high-ranking official in the Obama White House that even though Dr. Carson was correct in what he was advocating, that this was Washington, D.C., and they had to do what was politically correct, not what necessarily was in the best interest of the people. And so Dr. Carson, when he had the opportunity to speak at the prayer breakfast, what people don't realize, for the longest time, he always said, if I could just talk to the president, if I could tell him what's wrong with healthcare, because I think he's being misled by good, willing, meaning people, but I think he is for the better and the greater good, and I need to tell him.
And then so he did that at that prayer breakfast, and that speech got such a tremendous reception, and arguably was the launching pad as people started to think about Dr. Carson as perhaps a candidate for the presidency. Now, we only have a couple of minutes left, Armstrong, and you are no stranger to politics. So when you take a look at this unique person who is Dr. Carson and the whole gauntlet that is presidential politics, what has to unfold for Dr. Carson to pull off a victory?
If Dr. Carson doesn't commit gaffes, he gets a grasp of the issues, particularly foreign policy and issues were not necessarily his own, and surround himself with the right advice, and continues to listen to the American people, going where they are instead of being defined and redefined by the mainstream and other media. Dr. Carson has a unique opportunity of doing something very special in his 2016 presidential race.
We have seen some comments. Tavis Smiley comes to mind, other journalists of color, if you will, with comments about Dr. Carson that are disrespectful, to say the least. Why do you think we are seeing that reception from some of these journalists?
Well, obviously, these are establishment journalists. They feel Dr. Carson, who happens to also be an American who's Black, certain things he should not believe or subscribe to, and they don't want him to be truly free and speak what he believed. They want him to still have some shackles in certain areas. And Dr. Carson refuses to be anybody's slave, anybody's puppet. He knows what he believes. He believes he knows what works and what can work better. And so he's not going to be defined in some box that somebody can check off.
You've known him a long time. 15 seconds. What would surprise people the most about Dr. Carson?
Is that he's so humble and such a regular guy. When you're in the privacy of his company, you would never know that he's a presidential contender. He's just a regular guy who does basic things that we do and who can connect with anyone. He treats everybody the same. I don't care what your status is. Everyone is treated the same by Dr. Carson.
And we will leave it there. Sounds like the golden rule, a good rule to follow. Armstrong Williams, you have our thanks.